Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is great to be here with you. What a joy. I wandered into the historical, what is it? Is it Historical Society?
The museum.
The museum. I wandered into Robert's Museum almost a year ago as I was finishing this book. And I was writing about the Gloucester conspiracy, and I said, I got to get down there and just see the place. And what a treasure you have in Mr. Kelly. He's just incredible. He gave me a tour of the Main Street. We talked about just the history of this place, more recent history, its involvement in the education of black folks after the Civil War. It's a real honor to be here with each of you. And this book, I got to tell you, I'm a guy my parents' marriage was against the law in 1966, up in Baltimore. They moved out to Northern California. They shipped me back to Baltimore every summer. On the white side of my family, there are many summer camps. On the black side, there's one. It's called Grandma's House. It is a franchise with many locations. For my mom, it was Petersburg. For my grandma, it was Dinwiddie County. But for me, it was West Baltimore. And Virginia, for me, well, it was a place that my family had run away from twice. And I really wasn't sure why I would ever go back. I grew up with all my grandparents' stories and the pain, the indignities of segregation. And my mom told me that to get to her grandmother's house, she had to avoid going to the bathroom for 3 hours and eat fried chicken in the back of a car going 10 miles below the speed limit. I was like, I don't need to go to Petersburg, Mom, that's okay. But at the same time, it was a place that defined my grandmother in every way. And a lot of what we were most proud of as a family. And this book, in many ways, was me making peace with this state, with this country, what my family's been through, and trying to figure out how we all come together as a family. This book started many times. But the time I really got it started, I was at a gathering, and I'll read a little bit from this experience, but I'll set it up first. I was at a gathering in Monterey, California. That's where my parents had settled. There's a group called Renaissance Weekend. It has nothing to do with like Knights in Armor or Damsels in Distress. Before the Clinton Global Initiative, it's what the kind of Clinton's network did. And man, they're all workaholics. Every holiday weekend, they get together somewhere and they discuss big ideas. And Labor Day, historically, was Monterey. So I figured, I'll go, I'll check it out, stay at my parents' house. And every night, they put you at a different table with a different set of intense workaholics who want to solve all the world's problems over, drinks and dinner. And this is the last night of this conference. Couldn't find any food, but they kept giving us alcohol, so maybe I took a little bit too much to drink. And as we were waiting for dinner at our table, there was a couple sitting next to me, and what was most interesting is that she looked like she was about 80, and he looked like he was about 65. You're used to seeing that in reverse. So I was curious, and I leaned over and said, "So where are y'all from?" And he said, "Oh, we're from Los Gatos, California." I said, "No, where are y'all really from?" Los Gatos was an apple orchard when I was a kid. And he said, "Well, I'm from Minnesota, and my wife's from Virginia." I said, "Virginia? Where in Virginia?" He said, "Southern Virginia." I said, "Where in Southern Virginia?" He said, "Petersburg." I said, "Oh." I said, "My family's from Petersburg." So I'm curious, what are your wife's family names? I used to joke that my family, we were black in the Jeffersonian model of blackness. Because we're so light. Later, part because of this interaction, I figured out that we descended from Thomas Jefferson's grandma, so it wasn't a joke, it was just like a literal description. So my black grandmother's lighter than me. And so I said, "What are her family names?" "Oh, my wife's family name is Bland." That was her maiden name. I said, "Bland?" I said, "What's your wife's first name?" He said, "Maggie Bland." I said, "Huh." He said, "My grandma's Mamie Bland." Now, he's from Minnesota, right? The peculiarities and intimacies of the South, he doesn't know a whole lot about. He kind of more knows that he doesn't want to know. And so I look at him and I say, sir, I really don't know how to say this, sir. Again, I drank a little too much. He said, but I'm pretty sure your wife's family used to own my mom's family. Yeah. Then he looked at his wife, right? And they switched seats in an instant. I'm like, oh my God. And in a way that kind of people like, octogenarians, nonagenarians, my grandmother would die at 105 last summer. You get over a certain age, and you're kind of like a kid again, like sometimes like I'm traveling in Turkey or something, like a little kid will come up and just stare at you like this, checking out your Americanness, And this woman, Maggie Bland, she got right up in my face and just stared at me for what felt like forever. And all of a sudden, this smile erupted on her face, like, come here, baby, give me a hug. I always knew I had black family. So, of course, I had to ask why. I'm a former journalist, I always ask the question. How'd you always know you had black family? Ms. Bland. She said, well, I was kind of a miracle. My family, my parents, when I was born, my mom was 42. So they had moved out to San Francisco during the Great Depression. My brothers were much older than me. She said, I can remember when I was about 4, my brothers are 17 and 19. One of them dared to bring Abraham Lincoln's biography into the house. Well, they had to duel until they drew blood. Real antebellum family, like in the richest part of San Francisco, Pacific Islands. But Maggie was different. She explained that her mother was so busy integrating herself into San Francisco high society, she really didn't want to raise a third kid at 42. And then she said something I'd never heard somebody say before. She said, so my mom called back to Petersburg and she had Mammy sent out to watch the baby. Now, I always thought, if somebody said the word Mammy, it would be like nanny, like my nanny, our nanny. No, it was Mammy like Mommy. I said, well, so Mammy was your family? I said, yes. I said, how'd you know Mammy was family? She said, well, because when my mom and her sisters would get to squabbling on the party line, Mammy could get on that party line and squash that squabble in 20 seconds flat. She said, in the Bland family, only blood could do that. So she started calling me cousin right away. I thought it was kind of cool, it was interesting. My grandmother, on the other hand, 25 years, no, probably 15 years her senior, wasn't so excited about the whole thing. I went to go talk to my grandma, she said. She asked them 15 questions. I called Maggie. Maggie answered them all the right way. That left my grandmother more trouble. She said, ooh, baby, I knew those people when I was young. I'd be happy if I died without seeing them again. But then her curiosity got the best of her, and they met, and they resembled each other, and they actually had a lot in common. They're both quite lovely. They enjoyed each other's company. Maggie and I would stay in touch. And I'm going to read to you a conversation we had right after Hurricane Katrina. Well, here, back up just a little bit, give you a little bit of a family. So she, when I approached my grandma, named Mamie Bland, about the prospect of meeting our likely cousin named Maggie Bland, my grandma shrugged. That's okay, baby. I knew those people when I was young. I have no interest in reconnecting with them. I explained that Maggie was different, that she was born in California and had been a hippie. I shared that she was raised for her first 12 years by a black woman who she believed was her cousin. Maggie was eager to reconnect with more black members of her family. In fact, she had been looking for us her entire life. Mammy had been sent away when Maggie was 12, without warning. And she had a hole in her from that. My grandma said she'd think about it. She said, no, I'd be happy if I never saw them again. To say she knew them was an understatement. She was born a black Bland in Dinwiddie County, where many of the most prominent blacks and whites shared that unfortunate adjective as their family name. I'm pretty sure my mom was ready to marry a guy named Jealous because Bland ain't much better. Moreover, her great-grandfather, Frederick Bland, was the only slave mentioned in the will of Richard Yates R.Y. Bland, who owned Fred, his wife, Nancy Yates, and their children. It is my will and desire that my body servant Frederick be kept in the family where my sons may live, to wait on them, to attend to home business, gardening, and so for him to make his board, if no more. He is never to work out as a field hand, nor under an overseer. R.Y. Bland had many slaves, but only one was mentioned in the will. And every word of the mention was dedicated to protecting said slave. Why? Well, when the Harvard University historian Henry Louis Skip Gates pored over the will and other assembled evidence, his conclusion was concise. R.Y. Bland knew Fred was his older brother and wanted to protect him. It was clear the sudden appearance of a white cousin unsettled my grandmother in ways for which she was not prepared. Then she said yes. On some level, she wanted the healing that Cousin Maggie was looking for too. They met. It was brief. The family resemblance was clear. A loop had been connected. I thought that was it. And then one day, my phone rang. Hey, Cousin Ben. Ah, Cousin Maggie, what can I do you for? Cousin Ben, you run a foundation, don't you? Yes, I do. Well, I need help. Hurricane Katrina has caused a real mess, and we all need to help. Hurricane Katrina had rolled through New Orleans just days before. The country was abuzz with concern. Everyone was trying to help however they could. Cousin Maggie continued, I have a family from the lower Ninth Ward who are in an especially urgent situation. I had the unfortunate task of explaining to my newfound cousin that there was nothing my foundation could do. By charter, we only funded in California, we only funded civil rights advocacy. Direct aid to individuals in Louisiana was way out of our territory. Well, then just listen to me, she insisted. All right, cousin, hit me. I have these two boys. They're in a nursing home up in Baton Rouge, in the hallway. They were sent there after they were rescued from their family home in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. The parents owned a family-run printing business, but the floodwaters came in and destroyed everything. The boys had to be rushed out right away. One is in an iron lung, and the other one probably should be. Now they're in this nursing home hallway up in Baton Rouge. And although the nursing home is far from the flood zone, it's been inundated with wind and rain. The mold is building up, the spores are floating in the air. If they get in those boys' lungs, they could both die in a matter of days. As Maggie talked, I remembered that my godbrother, Dave Chappelle, had called the day before to ask me to keep my ear to the ground for any individuals who needed help. It's been previously explained in the book that my godfather is Dave Chappelle's dad, Bill Chappelle. This is Dave talking. Dave says, my imam said to give alms to any individual who asks. I didn't expect any individuals to find me, quite honestly, in San Francisco. I hadn't really given it another thought. But now here was my cousin Maggie Bland, descendant of the men who owned my family, descendant of the men who raped my great-great-grandmothers and their mothers, asking me for help. I called Dave and explained that Maggie needed an air ambulance to get the boys from Louisiana to California. Absolutely, Dave said. Call my accountant and give her the information. I called right away. The funds were wired. The two boys in the nursing home were airlifted out to Sacramento and given a new home. Their family was able to rebuild their lives. Maggie was elated. I went back to working on the issues of the day in California. Low-wage workers fighting to make enough to support their families, farm workers protesting unsafe working conditions, formerly incarcerated mothers and fathers struggling to find work. A few weeks later, Dave and I were on the phone. I was the closest thing to a lawyer in the family, and he would often call when there was a difficult situation to work through. While we were talking, he excused himself. FedEx was at the door. It reminded me that I had an unopened FedEx envelope, too. I reached for it. It was from Sacramento. Dave, I said, where's your FedEx from? It's from Sacramento, he said. I think it's that family. Yeah, I've got one here too, I said. Let's open it. I heard the envelope rip on his side of the phone before I ripped open mine. Dave slid out the photograph as I slid out mine. He was quiet. I was quiet. Ben, did you know the family was white? Dave, I had no idea, man. Maggie said they lived in the lower 9th Ward. I assumed they were black. Yeah, me too. It was a large photograph. We each pulled it all the way out of the envelope and turned it over to read the inscription on the back. Thank you, Ben. God bless you. The Goldman family. Ben, did you know they were Jewish? Dave, I didn't know they were white. It never occurred to me they might be Jewish. Well, the Lord definitely works in mysterious ways, Ben. Do me a favor, brother. Don't tell anybody about this for a while. Sure, Dave. Why not? I have no idea how to explain it at the mosque this week. I paused and I said, Dave, just tell him this is exactly how America is supposed to work. Only in America could the former slave-holding side of the family call the formerly enslaved side of the family in order to get alms from a black Muslim to help some poor white Jews get out of lower And, you know, Pastor saying the sermon in a sentence, that's basically the sermon in a sentence. Our country would work a whole lot better if we just sort of presume that we're all cousins. We're all related. Could be 50 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 50,000 years ago. I mean, my mom, you know, black, born in Petersburg, last of the family born in Petersburg. My dad, white, his family's been in Upper New England since 1624. Since one of the co-founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And yet, if you trace their DNA back, they're cousins multiple ways. They're cousins because of royalty in England and France. Both them descend from my mom, founding families of Virginia, my dad, family foundings of Massachusetts. They were all cousins to start with. They're cousins in the Nile River Valley 50,000 years ago. One is an L1, the other one's L1b, as far as their genetic mutations, the earliest humanoid genetic mutations. This country, as I started to, as I processed this book, one of the things that really hit me was how utterly unnatural the experiment of segregation is. We tend to impose this view based on, say, what segregation was like when my mom was growing up in the 40s or whatever, backwards into American history. And sort of sanitize it and separate it in a way that just wasn't so. It's to take nothing away from the indignities, the inhumanity, the torture of slavery. It is to say things have always been a little more complex. I can remember going to Monticello when I was a kid. And, you know, I'm a little mischievous and always a little bit of a Jack Lake historian. So the first question Susan asked, tell me about Sally Hemings. It was like 1989. I was a page for Leon Panetta of the U.S. Congress. We were visiting a lot of Virginia schools and monuments and such. And the man got so rigid. He was just like, he was like this. He was like, as far as I can tell, the only passion Thomas Jefferson had outside of politics was architecture. I was like, I'm pretty sure no man wants to be remembered that way, but okay. Well, now, you know, we deal with the fact that she was a slave, they had lots of kids, she was quite young. We don't really get into the fact that she was Mrs. Jefferson's sister. I mean, If there's one thing like you don't want your widow coming back to haunt you about, is getting with her sister. And, you look at that, right? Frederick Bland, older brother of Richard Yates Bland, and Frederick's wife's name is Nancy Yates. What Maggie and I were able to figure out how to do was just open our hearts to each other and to the possibility that there were always connections that confirmed people's equality and humanity for each other in contravention to whatever the laws or the customs were at the time. Just like Maggie being 12 years old in the, early 1940s, bereft because the woman that was her surrogate mother had been ripped away from her without anyone. Convinced she had a whole lot more black family. And unable to make the connection and figure it out until there we were at this conference. Me a little drunk and a little impolite. The best of intentions, but still. The Gloucester was important to me to get to because it's pretty cool to see a in memoriam for Nathaniel Bacon. Like, that's kind of awesome for a history team. And I love it says his so-called rebellion, and it slanders Governor Berkeley. That's just great. As far as I can tell, Berkeley deserved it. But when I was in college at Columbia University, I took Politics 101 from a guy named Charles V. Hamilton. He was the co-author of Black Power with Stokely Carmichael. He was the first tenured black political scientist at Columbia. He was an advisor to Doug Wilder, David Dinkins, first black mayor of New York, Harold Washington, first black mayor of Chicago, all the year before I took his class. That was 1989. They all won coming out of the Jesse Jackson campaign. And so he was kind of on a high professionally at the moment. And we were all excited to learn from him. And the last day of class, he said, please, y'all have been pretty quiet. We were scared of the guy. He looked like Scrooge McDuck, if you ever saw him. Dour and intimidating, and he knew everything, and so why ask? Just listen. He said, it's the last, no questions too dumb, just ask whatever you want. Please, just ask anything. It's our reason. He asked Mr. Jealous a question. I said, Professor, you call this political science 101, sir? I heard a lot of politics, I haven't heard of science. Where's the science, sir, of political science? He said, well, Mr. Jealous, he said, I don't know that you'll ever find any science of politics, but I'll tell you this, sir, it has a lot in common with physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Something in motion will return to its original state. So race relations, for example, is always in motion in America. But as Americans, we don't read too much. We like to watch things. And we can only really remember what we've seen on a screen. We talked about Roots. Now it'd be like Django or 12 Years a Slave. He said, invariably shows like that to show you slavery near its end. The end is not the original state of anything, Mr. Jones. Never forget what Howard Zinn told us in his People's History of the United States. Before there were slave rebellions, there were colonial rebellions. Figure out that one, Mr. Jealous, and you'll understand where we're headed. The first time I saw that viscerally, what he meant, what he was talking about, of course, was that Gloucester 1663, Bacon's rebellion, were indentured Europeans and enslaved Africans coming together to demand better treatment for their families. They used the military to split the two groups. Didn't quite work. They created new laws to split the two groups. Didn't quite work. Then they reached for the cudgel that was culture. You hear people say things like, we Irish are a mighty race. We Scots are a mighty race. I gotta say, I'm more like proud of the 20% of you that's Irish and the 49% that's English, but that's a whole thing. And what they're using, the way they're using the word race is the original meaning. From the 1100s, when it came in to Italian as raza, until the early 1700s, when suddenly the meaning shifted, what race had meant was genus or type when applied to things, nation or tribe when applied to people. And sure enough, enslaved Africans for the first 100 years after 1619 were listed as slaves of European nations, have been listed for at least a millennia, if not more, which was as people taken from different places under different circumstances. But after the early 1700s, one of my other professors at Columbia, Barbara Fields, would win a MacArthur Genius Award for figuring this out. We, Negroes, black folks, became listed like animals. Negroes was a term that was part of this crazy new definition of race. I mean, literally crazy. Because the idea was that there were multiple human races. Now, when I watch The Hobbit with my kids, I feel like the English might be predisposed to imagining there are multiple different types of humanoids. Because they got like trolls, dwarves, elves, you know. So maybe it was just the predisposition of the culture. I don't know. But folks like me, white dad, black mom, been called mulattoes ever since because we're likened to mules. Well, a mule can't have a baby, but I got two. Thomas Jefferson had a whole bunch. But I say that just to point out the obvious, which was if mulattoes were having kids, then there was something wrong from the theory that was pretty obvious since before the theory was created. And yet, what they were trying to do was sort of like, you have to ask yourself, why was it that this term, this new crazy definition was embraced, was popularized by colonial governments and the corporations that every colony was, just like the old Massachusetts Bay Colony. In other words, like what was in it for them? How did it make life better? Because the biggest threat to any colony was that indentured Europeans and enslaved Africans would get together. It was the biggest threat. You know, that actually didn't quite work. Well, how do we know it didn't quite work? Because, you know, there are two records founding fathers left of the Boston Massacre. One is Paul Revere's etching. It shows everybody massacred as white, and of course all the British soldiers as white. The other, and that was slightly amended by some abolitionists 70 years later who painted Christmas addicts into it, who was the one black person, the first person killed that day, and he was black. But the other record of the Boston Massacre was left by John Adams. John Adams was the defense attorney for the British military men who killed those young Americans, the Boston Massacre. And in his defense of the Redcoats, he describes the crowd assembled. Negroes, mulattoes, and Jack Tars. Jack Tar is a term for poor white sailor. The other two are descriptors for black people. Whatever we were talking about the Boston Massacre, that wasn't it. That wasn't it. And so, as I started with Gloucester and Bacon's Rebellion and looking at these changing of laws and then realizing, wait a second, here's this remnant kind of artifact of the Boston Massacre, and it looks like, well, working class black folks and working class white folks keep getting together in rebellion. I started to research, and I'll close and take questions. I started to research my grandmother's grandfather. You know, there were a couple of mysteries in this book that I was trying to solve. One of them is the title. 30 people just bought the books. I'm not going to tell you about that. But it blew my mind. The other was that my grandmother was on fire to end poverty, maybe even more than racism. And she was a soldier in the Civil Rights Movement. She was a leader in the war on poverty in Maryland. She was one of the first black, maybe the first black woman executive in Maryland's government. It was so early that the governor had to give her a named parking place because the cops kept trying to tow her car for being in the, they thought it was kind of the white executive's place. It was just government executives, and she was one. But man, if you started talking about poor folks in West Baltimore, she wouldn't go to racism. She would start talking about the universal problem of poverty in Maryland, and poor white folks in Appalachia. You know, I was talking about like right down the street, Grandma. She said, "Let me just tell you the whole thing." Okay. And then I realized as I was researching this book and I was listening to her, she was 103 when I really got into writing this book. That she was every bit her grandfather's granddaughter, just like I'm her grandson. And her grandfather, what she had told me was this, that Edward David Bland, it's Fred Bland's son, Richard Yates Bland's enslaved nephew, was a black statesman during Reconstruction who helped start Virginia State University. That's all I knew. But here's the problem. He was in office after Reconstruction. Reconstruction ends 1876, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. He's in office like 1880, 1881, 82, 83, right around there. So I'm like, okay. And I start digging. She said he was a Republican. Well, that made sense. But then it shows up he's part of this other party called the Readjusters. I've never heard of the Readjusters. And as I read about them, they took over the Virginia state government for about 4 years. Well, I dig into it. What I figure out is this. He walked out of slavery about 17 years old, right at the end of the Battle of Appomattox. He would have known that General Lee was his cousin, because the Blands were very proud cousins to the Lee family. We all descend from Thomas Jefferson. He became a preacher, he became a cobbler. He would eventually run for office against a white Bland. It was Bland versus Bland in the Bland magisterial district. The black Bland won. At the time, the old oligarchs, the old plantation elite, were suddenly re-empowered because the Hayes-Tilden Compromise gave the vote back to the former Confederates. The Democratic Party was now ascendant. This is the old, obviously, conservative party at the time, just ascendant. And there was this crushing Civil War debt, and there were also this new phenomenon of free public schools. You got to imagine the old plantation elite were threatened by both black folks and poor white folks going to school. And it's much harder to manage either group, to control it. For whatever reason, the old plantation elites say, we can't afford the Civil War debt and the free public schools, we're going to have to shut down the free public schools. Pay the Civil War debt. And working class white men flee the Democratic Party and start their own party called the Readjusters. And the name comes from their demand, readjust the Civil War debt so we can keep our free public schools. Well, black Republicans, black Reconstruction era leaders were quite proud of the public school systems they had created. You know, during segregation, when my grandma would teach in Dinwiddie County, her grandfather's name, little plaque was still on the outside of the school building, of the school like headquarters, because he had given the land for most of the black schools in the county. And they told her to come around back because she was a black teacher, and she said, "Well, my granddaddy's name right there by the front door. I think I'll come on in." That was my grandma. Now you understand why she left. And the leader of the Readjusters was former Confederate General William B. Mahone. At the time, he was considered to be a bit of a class traitor. He wasn't the only former Confederate general to become a railroad baron, but the other ones were all suppressing populist rebellions by their workers. He decided to join it and lead it. And his rationale was, as a Southern railroad owner, he needed a populist movement to get federal dollars into his railroad. So better to join the rebellion than fight it, because you're going to need those votes to ultimately demand your due as a company to get the money invested in your railroad. And so my grandmother's grandfather approaches General Mahone. Says, you know, those schools you guys want to save, well, we want to save them too. You know, we helped start. They strike a bargain. Bland leads blacks into the Readjuster Party so thoroughly, the party becomes a majority black party. Stop me, people are taught in school, oh yeah, Johnny Reb and the Freedmen all got together about 1880. Like, we weren't taught that as kids, right? But it happened. Majority black party led by a former Confederate general. One of his key deputies, a freedman named Aberdeen Bland. The Readjusters, for 4 years, would take over the Virginia state government. both houses, and the U.S. Senator positions that they appointed. Not only did they save the free public schools, see the Virginia Tech here in the room, hat outside, a sweatshirt in the back, they radically expanded Virginia Tech to make it the working person's rival to UVA. They started what would become Virginia State as the first publicly funded teaching college for Negroes. They would quadruple the number of black teachers in Virginia in 4 years. They abolished the public whipping post. They abolished the poll tax. They raised taxes on corporations, driving Virginia from a deficit into a surplus. They were put down by aggressive disinformation that spawned violence in places like Danville, and ultimately appeals to white supremacy and the terror of the Ku Klux Klan. The interesting thing was that Bland approached Mahone, knowing that Mahone was credited with massacring an entire black regiment at the Battle of the Crater that had surrendered. But, you know, honestly, Bland had also been fighting the Klan for 4 years, and, you know, better to have that guy fighting the Klan with you than have to deal with him too. Why wouldn't they ever teach us that as kids? What came after? Segregation. And what was more threatening to the very notion, precepts of segregation, than the idea, than the fact, than the history that just before, in this transition period between the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, 1876, the real kind of rise of Jim Crow in Virginia starting in like mid-1880s. That in this little transition period, the late 1870s, early 1880s, the base of that readjuster party was former Confederate soldiers. Former Confederate soldiers, and then Bland's base were freedmen, were formerly enslaved men, back in a time when women couldn't vote. That less than 20 years at the end of the Civil War, former Confederate soldiers and freedmen got together, took over the government, and improved the lives of all their families by saving free public schools and expanding higher education opportunities, getting rid of the poll tax, stopping the systematic humiliation and torture of black people in town squares. That was the public living post. Now, as a guy who spent a lot of his career as a voting rights activist, what blew my mind was this. Of course, when that was over, they reimposed the poll tax and we put into Virginia State Constitution in 1901, 1902. Right there in the arguments for it, in the debates, and they're amending the Virginia State Constitution at the start of the 20th century, former state senator became U.S. Senator, became U.S. Treasurer under Woodrow Wilson, Glass. State Senator Glass says, you know, yeah, this will disenfranchise a lot of white folks, but it'll disenfranchise more black folks. And he reasons it will restore white supremacy as a law of the land in every county in Virginia. It's a quote I've received. I'd always glazed over that a lot of white folks part. So I went back and said, well, how many is he talking about? When the poll tax was imposed in Virginia, it disenfranchised 80% of blacks and 50% of whites. They didn't really teach us that part either. They just acted like it was a revenge on us. It fit into kind of a white supremacist motif. But what they didn't teach us about the multiracial populist rebellion that was the readjusters, and therefore they had no reason to explain to us that the poll tax wasn't just a response to black political power during Reconstruction, but actually a response to a much more recent rebellion of working class whites and black people joining together. That poll tax outlawed the entire readjuster party. 80% of blacks and 50% of whites. Mahone was ripped out of any history of the Daughters of the Confederacy as a race traitor. And yet, you know, as we debate the Williams of Virginia, if there was a white William who understood what we could be, if we came together, it was General Mahone. Oh. But Dr. King was trying to teach us when he was assassinated. Dr. King, you know, as I was reading that history, it occurred to me, I was like, wait, yeah, of course. Dr. King wasn't assassinated until he led the Poor People's Campaign, trying to unite whites and blacks across the color line. What was he trying to teach us? Yeah, you can clap for that. What was he trying to teach us? That racism, yes, is the boot on black folks' neck. It's also the wedge of a colonial society that profits by divide and conquer. How many times have we said divide and conquer and not really ruminated about the way that we had been divided and conquered, both of us? There are 16 million and change white people in poverty. There are 8 million and change black people in poverty. Do you see twice as many images of the white poor as the black poor? No. But all of them are paying a price for being divided. That was the threat of the Gloucester conspiracy. And that has always been the greatest threat to the few very wealthy who try to keep the rest of us and our children held back. You know, if you just think about civil rights assassinations from that way, Malcolm X was assassinated after he went to Mecca and came back and said racism the issue. Frederick Hampton, of all the Black Panthers, the one whose assassination was most premeditated, most militaristic in its execution, most overly aggressive, was the Black Panther leader who stood up and talked about a rainbow coalition and tried to bring the young patriots who were whites from the South, whose families had come up to work in factories and now were being sent off to Vietnam, just like the Black Panthers. The blacks from the South had come up to work in factories and sent off to Vietnam, tried to unite the groups. They go after him. In the NAACP, we have a lot of folks who have been assassinated, but the one who was assassinated so thoroughly that they never even found a tooth was Harry Moore and his wife, Harriet Moore. Roughly, I gotta get the year right, I think it's 1951, very early 1950s, Christmas night. Christmas Eve had happened, Christmas Day had happened, Christmas dinner had happened. They put their daughters to bed on the second floor of their ranch house on one wing, and the Moores went to sleep on the first floor at a different wing, and the Klan snuck under their crawl space and packed it full of dynamite and lit a fuse. And they were blown up so thoroughly, they couldn't even find a tooth. In society, in American society, and our arc as a country, is what we have to understand, is that racism is a wedge, meant to divide. Everybody gets divided, suffers. Our country gets held back. The greatest threat to America right now is the rest of the world's getting flat and competing with us. The way we dealt that in the same issue of the 20th century, we got flatter faster than the rest of the world. And we led the world by the end of the 20th century. The thing that always sticks with me when I say I'm in West Baltimore, or I'm in West Harlem, I'm some poor, resegregated black neighborhood, dealing with school kids, is a moment I shared on stage with Jack Kemp, the late Republican congressman turned candidate for president. We were in Los Angeles 10 years after the uprisings, after the riots, Rodney King. A lot of Black LA was burned. And Jack Kemp was at a lectern like this, and he was pounding. And every time he pounded, he said, "Our kids, da-da-da-da-da, our kids, da-da-da-da-da, our kids." And I'm in the wings waiting to go after him, and there's an older black woman sitting next to me who's kind of like, the way she moves through the crowd backstage, she was kind of like the queen mother of South Central Los Angeles, at least the corner that we were in. And she leans over to me and she says, "Where's he from?" I said, "I think he's from Buffalo." "Well, whose kids is he talking about?" As if nothing in her life had prepared her to see a white man, let alone a Republican, who had run for president, embrace the kids of South Central as our kids. I looked at her and I said, "Well, I'm pretty sure what he's trying to say is they are all American children, and we are all Americans, and so they're all our kids." Even in the history of this town, conversation, there were former Confederates who taught Freedmen. Maggie Bland had been wandering around, convinced she had black cousins like me she was eager to connect with. But we don't have to know our bloodline to know the obvious. So we are all in the same boat right now. When Jack Kemp was running for president, reporter jacked him up. He said, "How can you be running for president of the United States as a Republican and be a card-carrying member of the NAACP?" You know what Jack Kemp said? He said, never really thought about it before, but you know what I do? I've never had a problem fighting for the rights of men I used to shower with every day. We remember he was president, and he is remembered as president of Florida NAACP, who led a voter registration drive roughly 15 years before the Voting Rights Act and the era of the poll tax. Over 1 million people registered. What they don't mention is that part of the power to do that came from the fact he was also president of the Florida Progressive Party and was getting together poll rights for black folks. That's it, y'all. I really appreciate you. It's nice to be here with you. Let's have a conversation.